Hello, my name is Tim Nedwed. I work for ExxonMobil Upstream Research Company, and I'm the Oil Spill Response Senior Technical Professional Advisor for ExxonMobil. And I lead the Oil Spill Response Research Program that ExxonMobil has, and I've been doing that for the past 15 years or so. What I'm going to talk about today is a module that was under a larger short course for oils in the aquatic environment. And I'm going to talk about the module on oil spill management and response options. So let's get started. At a high level, the objectives of this module is to describe the oil spill response tactics that are used for this is focused primarily on marine spills, the challenges that we have with various response tools, and how an oil behavior in the environment and the challenges that provides to oil spill response. I'll describe how we prioritize resources at risk for decision making and protection, and helps guide oil spill response choices for and strategies. And I'll describe at a high level the oil spill response decision making process. So this next slide is the outline, and at a high level I'm going to talk about background, response complexities, resources at risk that I mentioned, response options and details, and the environmental monitoring that we have for oil spills after they happen. So jumping back up to the background, I'll describe the process we have for prioritizing resources at risk, right? Which could be humans, the environment, assets, and reputation. So humans, as I'll describe, humans are always given the highest priority and given the most protection. We won't put people at risk for oil spill response.
As the person who has responsibility for oil spill response, we don't want any response option to be ruled out in advance, and we want responders to have the option of determining what is going to be the most effective response option based on the spill scenario at hand, the type of oil, and the weather conditions and the environmental conditions and the location of the spill, and not have any constraints on what response options they can decide from. I'll describe at a high level the decision-making process we use that many oil spill responders use to define their response strategy that will be most efficient. And the historic name for that has been called NEBA, or the Net Environmental Benefit Analysis. It has the unfortunate term, but this is kind of the historic term that's been used to define this response strategy, but there's no benefit for an oil spill. Regardless of where the oil spill is, there's no benefit to it, so it's been kind of an unfortunate term, and the oil industry at least has been trying to switch to a term that's maybe more appropriate, called spill impact mitigation assessment. And so we're trying to transfer from NEBA to SEMA as the term we use for this decision-making process. I'll describe the tier response approach that industry uses to define, or the oil response groups use to respond to oil spills, and how they define different levels or different sizes of oil spills, and some of the things we do for contingency planning, drills, and then the oil spill response groups that we use. Next, I'll go into some of the response complexities. When oil gets spilled in the environment, oil slicks are very dynamic, and they're subject to the weather, winds, waves. The oil begins to lose volatiles and can emulsify. So the oil properties are changing it can be very quickly depending on the oil over time. I'll describe some of the logistical challenges we have with oil spill response for various equipment, and then how dynamic slicks are. Following that, I'll talk about resources at risk, shorelines, the different type of ecosystem compartments and how they're at risk, and how different type of valued ecosystem component, or the wildlife that's in the environment, is at risk. And a significant part of the talk I'll spend talking about the specific response strategies, or the response options we have. And you can see the list there of mechanical recovery with booms and skimmers, in situ burning and the various ways we can apply in situ burnings, dispersing the oil and using dispersants to put oil into the water column, and the various methods that we have for applying dispersants. And then I'll talk about some of the shoreline protection strategies, specifically about monitoring, how we monitor oil spills. All right, so this is just some high-level background, and really the kind of the highest level way we set priorities for oil spill response. And any oil spill response organization is going to have human health as the highest priority. And a company like ExxonMobil uses what's called the PAIR approach, or PEAR, and that's how we define or prioritize response strategies, or what we're going to protect during response. And the PAIR, P stands for people, so people are going to be the highest level and get the highest priority, obviously, and that's both the public and the responders themselves. Next is the E, which is for the environment. We want to protect the environment next. And then it's A is for assets, so we're trying to protect the assets of a responsible party. And then finally, the last thing that we are concerned about is protecting the reputation, so it's PAIR, P-E-A-R. But people are the highest priority, followed by then protecting the environment. So we don't want to put people in harm's way when we're doing oil spill response. All right, so this slide I'm talking about what we're, as I mentioned at the beginning, this net environmental benefit analysis, what we're trying to switch the terminology to spill impact mitigation assessment. And that's a structured approach that responders use during it can be used both during an oil spill response, but it needs to be done for oil spill preparedness. And what it allows you to do is kind of systematically compare the trade-offs of various response options. It can be a very structured approach, especially in the preparedness stage when you're not in the middle of an emergency, or it can be a very rapidly done technique. But it has the same kind of high-level steps to it, regardless of when it is applied. But fundamentally, it's designed to help decision makers choose a response strategy that is going to reduce the impacts from a spill as much as practical. And just quickly, the high-level steps to it is the first thing you do when you're conducting a SEMA or a NEBA is you need to compile and evaluate data about the environment. You need to know properties of the oil. You need to know the data on the environment. And then you can use modeling based on chosen spill scenarios to determine how the fate and trajectory of an oil slick in that environment. And then you can use that same modeling, and also you're using a group of expert opinions. So these efforts, this approach requires pulling together experts on both oil spill response and the environment of interest, and also stakeholders and responders to help guide you through this process. So after you compile and evaluate data, you're going to predict outcomes with the help of modeling, but also with the help of some expert knowledge. And you're going to compare outcomes to a no action, where you would just allow the oil spill theoretically to just move into the environment as it will, and you're going to predict the impacts that might happen from that. And then you're going to compare that impacts to various response strategy with the goal of minimizing those impacts. But part of that, the next step in that process is to look at the different impacts and balance trade-offs, because different response options, as I'll describe, are going to put oil in different compartments of the environment. So one response option is going to put more oil in one part of the environment than another response option. So you have to balance the trade-off of moving oil from one compartment to another to make decisions about what is going to be the most efficient response option. And then ultimately you're going to select the best response strategy that minimizes impacts to the environment. Okay, and most oil spill responders use this so-called three-tiered response approach to define response, to develop response strategies, and to develop stockpiles of equipment. And it's a three-tiered response approach. And it compares spill size, and it's just very loose terminology here of small, medium, and large, and there's no hard and fast rule on what a small spill is and what a medium spill is and what a large spill is. And it compares that to the location of the spill. Is it local to a stockpile of equipment or an operation, for example, an oil transfer terminal? Is the spill further away from that equipment but still within the region, or still further away from that location where there is potential for oil spill to happen? Or is it much further away and is it remote from those operations? So you look at those kind of large categories and you define Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, and you can see this kind of very basic diagram here that shows you a way to visualize that. So Tier 1 spills are spills that are located very near operations and very near stockpiles of equipment, and they're generally relatively small spills. And they're basically, you define Tier 1 as the local capacity to respond to that spill is sufficient. And so it might be in a harbor that's very near a loading terminal, for example, and the equipment that is stockpiled near that location is capable of handling that spill without having to call in outside resources. But as a spill grows in size, or as it moves further away from those operating locations and stockpiles of equipment, then you may need to pull in regional resources. Then we'd start calling a spill a Tier 2 type spill, and they're generally larger spills and further away from locations where there would be stockpiles of equipment. And then we have kind of the largest spill category, which is everything else. So this would be a really large spill that can be, any one of these can be near, very near locations where we have equipment, but you can, if that equipment becomes overwhelmed, even a spill that's located next to a loading terminal, for example, could be defined as a large Tier 3 type of spill. And that's where you're going to need to pull in resources from international stockpiles, and there are cooperatives, these oil spill response organizations that are available worldwide. They have large stockpiles of equipment, and they have the capability for transferring those large stockpiles of equipment from the stockpile locations to spill locations around the globe. So that's kind of a high-level way in which oil spill responders and oil spill response organizations define oil spills as either Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3. Next, I want to talk about the contingency planning process, and it can be a very detailed process, and I show it this diagram on the right. I'm not going to go through all the details of it, but it's outside of the NEBA process can be a component, or the SEMA process can be a component of it, but it's a very structured process where the oil spill scenarios are defined. For example, if you're putting in a new development in a location that doesn't have existing oil spill response capabilities, you need to have a more robust contingency planning process where you would define oil spill scenarios for your operation. So what would be the different types, and this can be based on a risk assessment. So what would be the most probable oil spill, right? Or which would be the highest risk oil spill. So it can either be a high probability oil spill with low consequences, or it can be a low probability oil spill with high consequences. So you choose from that risk assessment types of oil spill scenarios that you want to define for contingency planning. And then you'd go through this kind of structured process that I show with the diagram on the right, where you need to consider the regulations that are in place in the region where you're going to be operating. We would engage stakeholders, so local regulators and maybe local politicians, and even maybe local citizens who have concern about the operation, to get their input. And then you'd go through the process of analyzing the oil spill scenarios, conducting modeling, select the scenarios that you think are reasonable for developing contingency plans around. Then you would use those scenarios along with modeling to define types of equipment that you would need for example, for Tier 1 spill response, for Tier 2 and Tier 3 spill response. And so you would define that and define the response capability that you need, finalize and get the contingency plan approved, and then you'd implement the contingency plan by purchasing stockpiles of equipment as necessary. You train personnel, you conduct exercises, and verify that the equipment is going to allow you to have a successful oil spill response. And then ultimately, once that equipment is in place, you can periodically come back and maintain and review and update the equipment, make sure it is still consistent with the way the operations, if there's been operational changes, make sure that the equipment has been well maintained, and make sure that maybe there has been some new development in oil spill response and there needs to be some changes to the equipment. So it's a very structured process, but ultimately it's used to define what can happen during an oil spill for the three types of tiers of response that I described on the previous slide. Another important thing that's done in oil spill response is that there needs to be continuous improvement. So large oil spill response organizations and large oil-producing companies, all oil-producing companies, have teams of people that have responsibility for oil spill response. And so periodically those teams come together with and conduct desktop drills to test their oil spill contingency plans, and then but also to develop relationships with those that they need to that they're going to have to interface with if there ever is a spill. And all the people that are on these teams go through some oil spill specific training. For example, ExxonMobil has a course called University of Spill, and every year there are several hundred potential responders who go through that course to be trained on the specifics of incident command systems, the specifics of how different types of oil spill response equipment operate. So there is a structured process for continuously maintaining these responders with drills and training. And I mentioned the oil spill response organizations that we use. There are the large Tier 3 organizations, the international organizations that are located in strategic places around the world to allow these large equipment stockpiles to be deployed efficiently. But I've listed here the countries that have significant Tier 2 capability. So these are regional or national oil spill response organizations. And these organizations, many of them at least, are nonprofit organizations that are funded by the oil industry themselves. All right, next I'll talk about some of the response complexities, and you can see on this chart the main bullets of weather, the different types of crude oil, the remoteness of the location where a spill might happen, the range of impacted habitats, and then issues with daylight, which really can limit our ability to respond to an oil spill. But if we look at weather, it is really one of the most important factors for oil spill response. It can, certain types of, for a marine spill, certain types of weather conditions can completely eliminate the ability to respond to a spill because, as I said at the beginning, we're not going to put people in harm's way to respond to an oil spill. Mechanical recovery, as I'll describe on a couple of slides, can be very challenged as sea states increase and wind and waves pick up, and the ability to hold oil in booms and skim oil becomes challenged, so that response option can be very challenged simply because the sea states are too rough. And then, as I mentioned, we're not going to put people in harm's way, so there may be weather may be an extreme limiting factor for response in very high sea states. The crude oil itself can be very complex. Crude oil is made up of thousands of different compounds, and those thousands of different compounds can change the properties of crude oils over a pretty broad range. There can be a broad range of densities of crude oils. There can be a broad range of viscosities, and both of those things change how certain response tools, how efficient certain response tools can be during an oil spill response. So certainly understanding the crude oil that has been spilled is really critical for defining a response strategy. Remote locations can be quite challenging. The Gulf of Mexico in the United States is probably one of the best locations because of the large amounts of operations for oil that the oil industry has in the Gulf of Mexico. It means that there's a lot of equipment stockpiled throughout the Gulf of Mexico. So logistical challenges are as minimal as they can be in the Gulf of Mexico. But as you move further away from those locations and oil production and oil transport occurs in frontier regions, it can be quite challenging logistically to take personnel and equipment to a location where there might be an oil spill. And as I'll describe in another slide, speed is the key to oil spill response, and rapidly getting out to a location of an oil spill is very critical to minimizing the impacts from an oil spill. Another complexity is the range of habitats that could be affected from oil, and then there needs to be a good understanding of what the local environment is that can be that where an oil spill is. For example, you might decide to deflect oil from a sensitive marsh because getting oil into a marsh or a wetland can have long-term persistence and can cause significant impacts. and then deflect oil that's coming in from offshore to sandy or rocky beaches, which are considered to be less sensitive because they can self-clean, or they can be cleaned mechanically much more easily than a lot of wetlands and marshes. And I mentioned the daylight challenges. Most, if not all, response occurs during daylight. So in most locations, there's at least 12 hours of daylight that can be up to 12 hours of daylight in certain locations. But as you move farther north into higher latitudes, there can be times where there's no daylight, and the oil spill response becomes extremely challenged as visibility is lost from lack of light. All right, I mentioned in the summary at the beginning that spilled oil is very dynamic. So slicks can spread, thin, and break apart based on the whims of Mother Nature, so wind and waves and currents. It can take an oil that can be initially very thick after a spill and rapidly turn it into an oil slick that might be on average 1/10 of a millimeter thick. 1/10 of a millimeter is about twice as thick as an average sheet of paper. So that means even a relatively small amount of oil can spread and quickly cover a significant area of the sea surface. And even oil that's that thin can still cause impacts to surface-dwelling organisms that might come in contact with that oil. So marine mammals and marine birds and marine turtles and other organisms that live near the surface can be impacted by even very thin oil slicks. And then once that oil starts to thin, as I try to show with this image here, that oil slick will not be as cohesive, and it can break apart, and there can be smaller slicklets that start moving off in various directions. And they will have to be responded to separately. And a large slick that breaks up into many smaller slicks, if those slicks can be separated by just a couple of kilometers, oil spill response techniques that require vessel-based operations, there can be a significant amount of time between pulling up from one oil slick and moving to another oil slick to start new operations. And then the graphic I show on the right here of oil shows some of the types of weathering that we have. So as oil hits the environment, it can be, when it initially goes in the water, it can be considered fresh, and it's going to have all the volatiles and light components in it. But as soon as it goes into the environment, the lower molecular weight components of the oil are going to start to evaporate. That's going to quickly change the properties of the remaining oil slick, and make the oil slick more dense and more viscous. And in general, oil slicks that are more viscous are more challenging to treat by all oil spill response options, and losing enough of the volatiles can limit or eliminate a response option like in situ burning. Sunlight can photooxidize the oil slicks and change its properties because of that photooxidation. I mentioned the drifting and spreading that can happen. Oil can dissolve into the water column. Winds and waves can cause oil to emulsify and entrain water, so you can have a water and oil emulsion, with oil being the continuous phase, and that can cause significant challenges for oil spill response because of an emulsion, or what's called a mousse. The mousse can become extremely viscous and make it very challenging to collect oil and then flow oil from one location to another if you're trying to do mechanical recovery. But it also can increase the volume of material that needs to be collected. So mousse is an oil and water emulsion can be 70-80% water, depending on the sea states and depending on the oil. It can become 70-80% water very quickly. So you've suddenly multiplied the volume of material that has to be collected by 5-6 times. So the message from the slide is that response options get less efficient with time, and that's generally the case for all response options because of the challenges of weathering of the oil. All right, next I'm going to spend, I think, the next 3 slides talking about the resources that are at risk in the various ecosystem compartments that we have for marine oil spills. And the first one I have is I want to describe what resources are at risk for the water column. And obviously, it's the organisms that live in the water column. So there's potential exposure of those organisms to dissolved and dispersed oil. Now, you can get dissolved and dispersed oil regardless of the treatment option. So just having an oil slick on the surface in an energetic environment can cause some of the components of the oil to dissolve into the water column, and there can be natural dispersion of oil droplets. So that's what dispersed oil. So dispersed oil is oil droplets that are small enough to stay entrained in the water column. So organisms that are living in the water column can be exposed through the dissolved oil or uptake of dispersed oil, either through respiration or through ingestion. But what I tell people is that exposure can be minimal and short, and what we're doing when we talk about the decision tools that we use, the NEVA or SIVA analysis, we're trying to understand what the trade-offs for various response options can be. So exposure to water column organisms is not a good thing for the water column organism, but in certain cases there can be it can mitigate the overall impacts from a spill. Because in general, the organisms that live in the water column can either move away from the oil, so they can sense contaminants and move away. But those that can are usually organisms that have the ability to have reproductive schemes that allow for high losses and then rapid recovery. But also oil that goes into the water column in a large body of water offshore, that oil will dilute in 3 dimensions. And so my background is that I'm an environmental engineer, and one of the first courses I took in college was to describe that dilution is not the solution to pollution, right? That's the first thing I learned in graduate school. But in fact, during an emergency, dilution can be the solution to pollution, and oil spill is an emergency response. So putting oil in the water column allows the oil to dilute in 3 dimensions, and I'll describe on the next couple of slides how oil on the surface only has the opportunity to dilute mainly in 2 dimensions, and then oil that goes onto the shoreline really dilutes in only 1 dimension, right, because it kind of becomes a linear thing when it goes onto the shoreline. And then the third thing here is the water column is constantly moving. So oil that goes into the water column will have impacts that's kind of moving away. So the initial location where the oil was put into the water column can recover quickly because the dispersed and dissolved oil is moving away from that location. But it can cause disruption, obviously. And one of the primary things that it can disrupt is commercial and recreational fishing in the area, and that might have to stop for a period of time until specialists come in and determine that the water column is safe for fishing again. So some of the high-level risk drivers for oil in the water column is the volume of water that's available for dilution, how concentrated the oil can be in the water column, and then how long that oil will persist in the water column. And because dilution happens in 3 dimensions, oil dispersed and dissolved oil in the water column can rapidly dilute below concentrations that can cause acute or even chronic toxic effects. And so it can dilute within hours, depending on the environment, within hours to concentrations that could be below concentrations of concern for toxicity. So next I want to describe the resource risks for surface oil. So the potential exposure, there's potential exposure to wildlife and socioeconomic features, right? So there are organisms that spend the majority of their time on or near the surface of marine environments, and there's also fishing and other activities that can happen on or near the water surface. The exposure pathways to oil slicks is direct oiling of wildlife, birds, marine mammals, and turtles, and other organisms that would live near the surface. There's inhalation of volatiles that those organisms might encounter, particularly as the oil is fresher and those volatiles are being released into the air. So marine mammals and birds have to breathe, and turtles have to breathe the air above the water surface, and that air could have volatile organic compounds in it that could cause issues with them. And their exposure can also be through uptake of dissolved and dispersed oil as well. So I'm saying here exposure can be more severe than water column exposure because, as I mentioned on the previous slide, that the oil surface slicks only dilute in 2 dimensions, right? So now you have the surface of the oil, you don't have the 3rd dimension of water depth for dilution. So even oil that's coming up from the depths, for example, from a subsea release from a blowout, that oil can become quite dilute in the water column, but as it hits the surface, it's going to start concentrating at the surface, and then spreading only happens in 2 dimensions at the surface. So there can be higher concentrations of oil or higher loadings of oil at the surface because it is an interface and there's only dilution in two dimensions. Another issue with resources at risk near the water surface is that surface-dwelling organisms tend to have slower reproductive schemes. Birds, marine mammals, and turtles live in general longer and maybe significantly longer lives for turtles and marine mammals than fish, for example. And they have reproductive schemes that don't produce thousands or even tens of thousands for some fish species of eggs. And so there can be significant impacts because of the slower recovery that those types of organisms have. And then thick patches of surface oil can persist on the surface for long periods of time because of the weathering and the photooxidation that happens and the emulsification happens. So those oil slicks can persist for significant periods of time and be subject to Mother Nature, winds and currents, and move over significant areas. And then disruption can happen to tourism and other recreation as well as commercial and recreational fishing. So the drivers for risk are the size of an oil slick, how much area it's going to cover, how quickly it's going to move to other areas and potentially cause impacts, and then how long that oil slick is going to persist on the surface of the environment, either because it's weathered to become persistent or because it's moved to a shoreline and transferred into that environmental compartment. All right, so the last resource at risk I'm going to describe here is the shoreline and nearshore oil. And again, we have potential exposure to wildlife and socioeconomic features that can be even more dense in a nearshore or a shoreline or a coastal area. And
exposure pathways are very similar to surface oil, but there can be direct oiling of birds and marine mammals to liquid oil that is in the nearshore area or has stranded on shorelines. But in nearshore areas, there can also be uptake of dissolved and dispersed hydrocarbons, but the oil that has landed in a nearshore area can be a long-term source of some of these dissolved hydrocarbons to shallow waters in a nearshore area. And exposure can be more severe than either in the water column or on the water surface for oil that is stranded near shore or on the shoreline. And I mentioned this, but oil concentrates primarily in one dimension. So oil slicks that are really two-dimensional things on the water surface, when they hit a shoreline, they start concentrating in one dimension. And so that can bring more and more oil to a specific location. Oiled locations are fixed, right? So once oil hits the shoreline, it can be a significant period of time before that oil moves off of that shoreline. It's certainly not as transient as it would be in both the water column and on the water surface. And then many nearshore areas have high biodensity. Nearshore areas can be or are the nurseries for many aquatic organisms that even live in deep water offshore. So many nearshore areas are the breeding grounds for organisms that live offshore. So kind of one of the number one rules for oil spill responders is, and this isn't a complete hard and fast rule because there can be some locations where there's sensitive environments aren't necessarily nearshore. But one of the primary rules is that for oil spill response, to try to keep oil from stranding on shores. And one of the reasons, I described several of the reasons, but another reason is the oil in those environments can persist for the longest periods and stay in those environments for many years before full recovery happens. Tourism and recreation can be disrupted for oil that is stranded in nearshore and shoreline environments. Obviously, recreational fishing can be disrupted, and even commercial fishing can be disrupted. And the risk drivers are similar for an oil slick, but it's the size, the amount of shoreline that's been oil, the movement of oil on and off that shoreline and down the shoreline, and then persistence of oil in the shoreline, in the shoreline and nearshore sediments. All right, so the next few slides I'm going to describe the response tools that we have. So we call this the response toolbox. And at a high level, it's 3 active response options and then 1 option where we monitor and evaluate. The active response option are to use mechanical recovery with booms and skimmers. So corral the oil in a boom and then put a skimmer in it to recover the oil, and I'll have another slide to describe some of the details of that. We have in situ burning, again, where the oil has to be thickened to burn. Oil has to be thick enough to burn. 1/10 of a millimeter slick is likely not going to be burnable because too much heat is lost to either the water column or the air, and the oil cannot, the burn cannot sustain itself. So oil has to be thickened with either booms, and I'll describe a newer technology that we have using herders to thicken oil. But I have a slide describing in situ burning, and I have a couple of slides describing how we apply dispersants, but they can be applied by aircraft, by vessels, or subsea, and I'll describe those as well. Monitor and evaluate can be the option, so it's not the do nothing option, it's the monitor and evaluate. So there can be situations I mentioned where the weather conditions can be too severe for responding to an oil spill, and that's where you might have to and be forced to try to monitor the oil movement of the oil. So if conditions change, you can come in and take some active response action. Or it can be that the best option is to allow the oil to degrade and disperse in the environment on its own, because it's not going to go into a sensitive environment and cause significant impacts, either because of the location of this oil spill or because of the size of the oil spill. So mechanical recovery uses booms and skimmers to pick up oil and remove it from the environment. I always tell people that it's always going to be the most important and the most widely used response option there is, because it is the only one that takes oil out of the environment and puts it back in a container. And the reason and that's one of the reasons that it will be the most important response option. It's the only one of the ones I described that will take oil out of the environment, put it back into the container. The responsible party for the oil slick should be, if at all possible, should take the oil out of the environment and put it back in a container. And another reason it'll be the most important response is because the vast majority of oil spills are small, tier 1 type spills where booming and skimming is feasible. The challenge is that as oil spills get larger and get further away from stockpiles of equipment, mechanical recovery becomes very challenged. One of the reasons is because mechanical recovery has to be applied by boats. So you are traveling to the oil spill at the speed of a boat. You're transferring between oil slicks at the speed of a boat. And I mentioned at the beginning, speed is the key to offshore response because of the dynamic nature of oil slicks and how they're weathering and becoming more challenging to treat with all response options. So a response option that is limited to the speed of boats is going to be challenged. So mechanical recovery has limited encounter rates, has limitations because of sea states. It just becomes impractical to try to contain oil in booms when sea states get too energetic. And there's significant logistic requirements that I just require, but it's not just moving the equipment out to the oil slick. In mechanical recovery, the goal is to take the oil out of the environment and put it in a container. You need additional boats to hold those containers, and then you need to transfer those boats to land-based storage facilities. So it's a whole other level of logistical requirements for all of these steps that are required for mechanical recovery. In situ burning is another response option I described. So it's one of the 3 primary active response options, and it's where we use fire-resistant booms or herding agents to thicken an oil slick enough that it can sustain combustion. This graphic I show on the right here on the top is kind of the traditional way of applying in situ burning, where you use boats and then fire-resistant skimmers to thicken oil, and then you have some method of igniting the oil slick that's been thickened and allowing it to burn. The image I show down at the bottom, the graphic I show at the bottom of the helicopter, that is the graphic I have to show how herders work. Herders are surfactants that you'd apply to the water surface to change the surface tension of the water and kind of magically cause an oil slick to thicken. And I'll show you hopefully a video that's going to run here. This is a lab test of herders being applied to a slick in a in a test basin. So this man here is applying this small little syringe of surfactants, and he's treating about, I think, 10 or 15 liters of oil that's spread out on the oil surface, and you can see how the surfactants what they're doing is changing the surface tension of the water and causing the oil slick to contract into a much smaller area and kind of thicken with a chemical boom rather than a physical boom. And the advantage of herders compared to booms is that they can be applied from a helicopter. So now they can transfer to oil spills at the speed of a helicopter and transfer between individual oil slicks at the speed of a helicopter. And now all you need to ignite that slick is an incendiary device that could again be dropped from a helicopter to ignite the slick. So that's a newer technology that industry is trying to advocate for now to help enhance our capabilities to respond to oil spills. But the advantage of in situ burning, I list them here, it removes oil from the marine environment. So oil is taken off the water surface. An efficient burn can remove 90% of the oil from the environment. There is always going to be a residue of large molecules that are left. But in situ burning destroys the toxic components, leaving a relatively recalcitrant residue, because the toxic compounds in oil tend to be the more volatile compounds, and they tend to go up into the flames and be destroyed by the temperatures of the burn. And then compared to mechanical recovery, it limits the amount of storage and handling of oil. It doesn't eliminate it because there is a residue, and oftentimes there might be a desire to recover that residue, so the 10% of the oil might need to be recovered and stored and transferred. The challenges for doing in situ burning with fire-resistant booms are the limited encounter rate. So you're moving at the speed of vessels, and you're moving at quite slow speeds because booms have to be pulled at very slow speeds by vessels, or else oil gets entrained over or under booms. So just like mechanical recovery, in situ burning has limited encounter rates because of the need to move these booms by boats, and then the need to avoid entrainment of oil under or over the booms, so the boats have to move, and it's generally considered to be 3/4 of knot that these boats can travel to capture additional oil for in situ burning. There are sea state constraints, just like mechanical recovery for in situ burning, and again, there are the logistical requirements. This is for using fire-resistant booms, of having to have these vessels to pull the boom, so it's not as significant as it would be for mechanical recovery because you don't need to store as much or transfer as much oil. Herding eliminates many of those logistical challenges, because now you can use a helicopter to both apply the herder and apply the ignition device to ignite the slick. And herders, if you're going to herd a slick, it requires just a very small amount of the surfactants to herd large amounts of oil. So it is a potential future tool that could be put into contingency plans to allow in situ burning to be much more practical than it is right now with fire-resistant booms. And dispersants, what are dispersants? So dispersants are a way to enhance natural dispersion that can happen during oil spill response. So one of the things that's going to happen when oil goes in the environment is waves can hit it in the marine environment, and it can naturally disperse. But dispersants enhance that natural dispersion. But what are dispersants? They're solutions of surfactants dissolved in a solvent, and the goal when you spray those onto an oil slick is to reduce the oil-water interfacial tension. That causes mixing energy in the form of waves to disperse oil into the water column as very small droplets that can be entrained permanently and allow biodegradation to happen, because the droplets are so small that there's enough turbulence in the ocean that they stay entrained and don't resurface. Each droplet of dispersed oil can be a concentrated food source for microorganisms that can biodegrade petroleum exist in all marine environments because they have adapted to crude oil, because there are natural seeps that exist in all large marine bodies of water, and those natural seeps have occurred for millennia, so microorganisms have evolved to exploit that food source. So when an oil spill happens, those microorganisms are in place and ready to take advantage of that food source. And dilution, dispersed oil dilutes rapidly, and as I said before, to below concentrations that can be toxic in a matter of hours, and certainly less than a few days. But that dilution allows efficient aerobic biodegradation, because the oil will quickly dilute to concentrations that won't exhaust available oxygen and won't exhaust available nutrients that are needed for efficient aerobic biodegradation. Now, that's assuming you use dispersants in an offshore area where there is enough water volume for dilution. Dispersants have been developed over 40 or 50 years now, I guess, and they use ingredients that are found in household products. So the ingredients of modern dispersants use compounds that have been approved for use by the Food and Drug Administration in the United States for either human contact or even human consumption. And I would guess that most people in the United States at least have many of the compounds, if not all of the compounds that are used in the most widely used dispersants for oil spill response. They have those compounds in their bathroom, in their medicine cabinet, in their shower, in shampoos, in their kitchen, in dish soaps, or in some of the cleaning agents that they'd use in their house. And so because of that, the dispersant itself has much significantly lower toxicity than most oils. The advantages of using dispersant is it allows response at the speed of aircraft. That's for aerial application of dispersant, and I'll describe on the next slide subsea dispersant use. But for subsea dispersant use, it allows treatment of the oil at the release point before oil can move throughout, can disperse and dilute throughout the environment and spread. It can have a larger weather window than other oil spill response options. High wind and sea states are actually better for dispersion because it makes smaller droplets that can be more effectively dispersed. And dispersing oil into the environment can remove oil in a matter of a few days. Many of the compounds that are in crude oil have biodegradation half-lives that are on the order of 2 to 4 days to maybe 2 to 4 weeks. So a significant fraction of oil can be removed from the environment in a few days, leaving a more and more recalcitrant residue over time. The challenges with using dispersants, it trades more oil on the sea surface for oil in the water column, and that can cause the issues we have